Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take really dense scientific stuff, complex chapters, and make them make sense fast. Today, we're tackling forensic biology, Chapter 9, from a key textbook, actually. And it's all about a really fundamental question. How do forensic scientists actually see DNA? Make it visible for analysis.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but it's the critical step. You can do all the lab work, extract the DNA, run PCR, separate fragments. But if you can't visualize those tiny bits, measure them, and importantly, get that into a legal record, then what's the point? And the sources we looked at show this really interesting evolution. Started with, well, some pretty basic staining techniques, maybe even a bit hazardous, and ended up with these incredibly sophisticated multicolor laser systems we use today.
Okay, so our mission today is to really trace that path. Understand how the tech evolved to let scientists reliably turn invisible DNA molecules into solid evidence.
Precisely. And we'll break it down into three main areas. First, the sort of quick and direct methods, just staining the DNA right in the gel. Second, we'll look at the older, more targeted approaches using specific DNA probes, really important historically. And finally, the modern stuff, the fluorescence techniques that are absolutely essential to how DNA analysis, especially PCR-based stuff, is done now.
All right, let's start simple then. Direct detection in a gel.
Yeah.
This sounds like the most straightforward way, right? Just stain the DNA after you separate it.
It is the most direct, yeah. Quick and relatively simple. And the main way this is done is using what are called fluorescent intercalating dyes. Now, the classic example, maybe the most famous one, is ethidium bromide, ETBR. Though I should say most modern labs try to avoid it now if they can.
Intercalating.
Now,
Okay, what does that actually mean? What's the dye doing to the DNA molecule itself?
well, it literally means inserting itself in between. Think of the DNA double helix like a ladder or maybe a spiral staircase. These dye molecules, they're flat, and they slide right in between the rungs, the base pairs. They wedge themselves in there. And once they're stuck inside the DNA structure, the whole complex, the DNA plus the dye, it gains this ability to absorb and then emit light.
Ah, okay, so it makes the DNA itself glow under the right conditions. How do you actually see it clearly, like on a gel photo?
So you take your gel, stained with ETBR, and you put it under an ultraviolet light source, usually around 300 nanometers wavelength. The DNA dye complex absorbs that UV light, but then almost instantly it emits light back out, but at a longer wavelength, around 590 nanometers for ETBR. And that emitted light, that's fluorescence, and it shows up as this visible orange glow exactly where the DNA bands are in the gel. It's pretty sensitive, too. You can see bands down to about 10 nanograms of DNA.
10 nanograms is tiny. That sounds great. But I feel like there's a but coming. You mentioned labs try to avoid ETBR now.
There is a big but. ETBR's structure is unfortunately quite similar to the DNA bases themselves, which means it can actually mess with the DNA structure, potentially causing mutations. So it's considered a mutagen, maybe even a carcinogen. Handling it requires real care UV protection for your eyes and skin, special disposal procedures because it's hazardous waste.
Right, that sounds like a major headache and a risk.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why newer, safer dyes were developed. Things like the SYBR stains. They work similarly, intercalating, but they're designed to be much less mutagenic and often perform even better in terms of sensitivity.
Okay, so ETBR is quick, sensitive, but hazardous. What if you needed even more sensitivity back in the day, maybe for older techniques like VNTR profiling? The sources mentioned silver staining.
Yes, silver staining was a big deal, especially for things like VNTRs and AFLP historically. And the big advantage, sensitivity. It's roughly maybe 100 times more sensitive than ETBR. Plus, it's significantly less hazardous to handle. It works on a different principle. DNA has that negative charge along its backbone, right?
Some of the phosphates.
Yeah, exactly. So you bathe the gel in a solution with positively charged silver ions, Ag plus O for A. They're attracted to the DNA and bind to it.
Okay, so the silver ions stick to the DNA. But silver ions aren't visible, are they? How do you see the bands?
Right, that's the next step. You add a chemical called a reductant formaldehyde was common. This chemical reaction reduces the silver ions, the Ag plus A, into metallic silver, just plain Ag atoms. These tiny metallic silver particles build up right where the DNA is, creating these dark, almost black, visible bands on the gel, and it's permanent.
Wow, 100 times more sensitive and safer. That sounds like a huge improvement.
Yeah.
Were there any downsides? Why didn't everyone just switch to silver staining?
Well, the main issue was specificity. Silver staining is, well, it's not very picky. It stains DNA, yes, but it also stains RNA quite well, and proteins too. So if your sample wasn't absolutely pure DNA, you'd get all sorts of extra bands and background haze, making it hard to read the important DNA bands.
Oh, okay. Noise.
Lots of noise. And another quirky thing, especially with certain types of gels, polyacrylamide gels used for single-stranded DNA. Sometimes it would stain both the original strand and its complementary strand if they separated slightly, giving you this confusing two-band pattern when you were only expecting one marker. Cleanup and interpretation could be tricky.
Right. And that lack of specificity, plus just needing to detect specific DNA sequences, not just any DNA, that pushed the field towards the next set of techniques. Hybridization assays. These use specific DNA probes to hunt down and flag only the sequence you're interested in. This was absolutely crucial for early forensic DNA testing, like for VNTRs.
Probes. Okay, so you design a small piece of DNA that matches your target. But how did they make that probe visible back then, before all the fancy fluorescence, I think the sources mentioned, radioactivity?
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Radioactivity was the standard for a long time. For those early VNTR tests, and also for just measuring how much DNA you had, radioisotope labeling was key. They'd use a method, often Nick translation, to basically build radioactive atoms into the DNA probe itself, usually tagged nucleotides.
And the isotope of choice was phosphorus-32. That sounds familiar from, like, biology class.
That's the one, phosphorus-32, or 4-4AP. It emits energy, beta particles, and it has a relatively short half-life, only about 14 days, which was sort of manageable, but also a constant issue. To actually see where the probe bound, they used a technique called autoradiography.
Autoradiography. So basically like taking an X-ray. You expose photographic film to the radioactive sample.
Essentially, yes. You'd lay the membrane or gel with the hybridized radioactive probe against a sheet of X-ray film, usually in a light, tight cassette. The energy particles shooting out from the decaying 4-4EP would hit the film and create tiny specks, a latent image. Then you develop the film chemically, like an old photograph.
Wow. So you're handling phosphorus-32, which decays pretty quickly. And then you might have to wait how long for the exposure?
Days.
It could definitely take days sometimes, yeah. Because a lot of the radioactive emissions just pass straight through the film without leaving a mark. You needed enough hits to build up a visible signal. So you had the obvious safety hazard of working with radioactivity, plus these potentially really long waiting times. It really drove the search for safer, faster, non-radioisotopic methods.
Which leads us nicely to chemiluminescence. Getting light out of a chemical reaction, but without the radioactivity. That sounds much better.
It was a massive improvement. A really popular system involved using an enzyme called alkaline phosphatase, or AP. The DNA probe would be chemically linked or conjugated to this AP enzyme. Then, after the probe binds to the target DNA, you add a special chemical substrate, a chemiluminescent one. When the AP enzyme encounters this substrate, it acts like molecular scissors.
It cuts something off the substrate. Exactly. It cleaves off a phosphate group. And that single chemical cut triggers the substrate molecule to become unstable and immediately release energy in the form of a photon, a tiny flash of light.
Light, but generated chemically.
Precisely. And that light, although brief, is enough to expose X-ray film, just like the radioactivity did. But it happens much faster and, crucially, without any radioactive hazard. This was huge for methods like RFLP analysis.
Okay, that makes sense. Enzymes doing the work. And then the sources also mentioned biotin, using a vitamin. That seems unexpected in DNA detection.
It's actually quite clever biochemistry. Biotin, which is vitamin H, can be incorporated into the DNA probe during synthesis. The key thing is that biotin is really small, chemically speaking. Its molecular weight is only about 244. So sticking it onto the probe doesn't really affect the probe's ability to find and bind to its target DNA sequence. It doesn't get in the way.
Okay, so the probe has biotin attached. How does that help you see anything? Does the biotin glow?
No, biotin itself doesn't glow. It acts more like a tiny, super sticky handle. It has this incredibly strong, almost unbreakable natural attraction to a protein called avidin, found in egg whites, or, more commonly used in labs, streptavidin, which comes from bacteria. Streptavidin is generally preferred because it gives less non-specific background signal. It's a very clean binding.
Got it. So the probe has biotin. Biotin grabs streptavidin. Is the streptavidin the thing that makes the signal then?
Almost there. The streptavidin itself isn't the signal either. It acts as the bridge. The streptavidin molecule is conjugated linked to a reporter enzyme. A very common one is horseradish peroxidase, or HRP.
Okay, another enzyme.
Right. So now you have this chain. DNA probe binds to target. Biotin on probe binds streptavidin, and streptavidin carries the HRP enzyme right to the spot. The final step is adding a substrate for HRP. And this is where labs had choices. They could add a substrate like TMB. When HRP acts on TMB, it produces this intense blue color that doesn't dissolve. It precipitates right there. That gives you a visible blue spot, a colorimetric detection. Great for dot plots or things you look at directly.
Or could they get light out of HRP too?
Yes. They could also use a different luminol-based substrate. HRP acting on that catalyzes a reaction that produces light chemiluminescence again, similar to the AP system.
So this whole biotin streptavidin HRP system was really versatile, color or light, and critically, no radiation. This sounds like it really set the stage for modern methods.
Absolutely. High sensitivity, flexible output options, and crucially, safe. It bridged the gap perfectly to the next big revolution.
And that revolution is fluorescence, tied directly to PCR. This feels like where we enter the modern forensic lab. This tech changed everything, didn't it? Especially for tiny samples.
Completely changed the game. Being able to analyze minute amounts of DNA, degraded samples, things that were impossible before. The advantages of fluorescence detection are huge. Much higher sensitivity than most older methods, a wider dynamic range meaning it can measure very faint and very strong signals accurately in the same run. And maybe the biggest practical advantage, multiplex PCR.
Multiplexing, that's analyzing many different DNA markers all at the same time in the same tube, right? How do they manage that? How do you label 20 different things at once?
The key is using different colors. The standard way, especially for STR profiling the core of forensic DNA typing, is using dye-labeled primers. During PCR primer synthesis, they chemically attach a specific fluorescent dye molecule to one end, usually the 5' end, of one of the primers in each pair.
Only one primer in the pair.
Typically, yes. Labeling only one strand avoids that two-band confusion we talked about with silver staining. You get one clear peak per marker, and they have a whole palette of fluorescent dyes that glow in different colors. Common ones are FAM, blue, VC or Joe, green, NED or Tamra, yellow, Petit, red, and Izzy, orange. So you can label different STR markers with different colored dyes and run them all together.
So you use colored primers for STRs. What about other things like DNA sequencing? Do they use primers there too?
For some sequencing, yes, but another common method, especially for things like mitochondrial DNA sequencing, involves labeling the fragments using fluorescently tagged dideoxynucleotides, or DDNTPs. These get incorporated as the DNA strand is synthesized, labeling the end of the fragment.
Okay, the DNA is labeled with different colors. Now, the physics, how does the machine, the genetic analyzer, actually see these different colors and tell them apart accurately?
It boils down to the properties of the fluorophore. That's the part of the dye molecule that actually does the fluorescing. Inside the machine, there's a light source, often a powerful argon ion laser tuned to specific wavelength. This laser light hits the dye molecule attached to the DNA fragment as it passes a detection window. The energy from the laser photon excites an electron within the fluorophore, bumping it up to a higher energy level.
Okay, it gets energized.
But it doesn't stay there long. It's unstable. Almost immediately, the electron drops back down to its normal ground state. As it drops back down, it releases that extra energy as another photon of light. And that photon is the fluorescence signal we detect.
And you mentioned the Stokes shift earlier. Is that important here for telling the colors apart?
Critically important. The photon that the dye emits always has slightly less energy, and therefore a longer wavelength, than the photon from the laser that excited it. That difference in wavelength between the excitation light and the emitted light is the Stokes shift. The machine's optical system uses filters specifically designed around this shift. It filters out the original laser light and only lets the longer wavelength fluorescent light from the dye pass through to the detector, like a CCD camera.
That makes sense for one color. But if you have 5 colors, blue, green, yellow, red, orange, all being excited maybe by the same laser, don't their emitted light spectra kind of overlap? Won't the green signal spill into the blue detector a bit?
They absolutely do overlap. It's not perfect separation just by filters. You're right, the raw green signal might have a little bit of blueness to it, and the yellow might have some greenness. If you didn't correct for that, your results would be a mess.
So how do they correct it?
With math. Before analyzing any real samples, the instrument is calibrated using pure samples of each dye. The software measures how much, say, the pure green dye signal spills over into the blue, yellow, and red detection channels. It builds a mathematical matrix based on this calibration. Then, during the analysis of the actual forensic sample, this matrix, this fluorophore separation algorithm, is applied to the raw data. It effectively subtracts the known overlap from each color channel, giving you a pure signal for each dye. That clean signal is then measured in relative fluorescence units, or RFU, giving you the accurate profile. So if we just step back and look at the whole journey described in this chapter, it's really a story of increasing sensitivity and specificity driven by the needs of forensic science. We started with, just generally staining DNA with things like ETBR, which worked but had hazards, then moved to detecting specific sequences with probes, first using radioactivity, which was sensitive but slow and hazardous, then clever enzyme systems like AP and HRP biotin, getting away from radiation but still often relying on membranes or blots. And finally, arriving at today's PCR-based fluorescence detection, super sensitive, capable of multiplexing many markers at once using different colors, all read by lasers and sophisticated optics and software.
And it's that combination, the high sensitivity allowing analysis of trace evidence and the high throughput from multiplexing and automation that really underpins modern forensic DNA profiling.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think that the ability to get a full STR profile from maybe just a few skin cells touched on an object that rests entirely on this really complex stack of chemistry, physics, and optical engineering we just discussed, making the invisible visible and quantifiable.
It really is remarkable, which leads to maybe a final thought for you to consider. Every DNA match you hear about, every cold case solved with DNA, it relied on scientists mastering one or more of these fundamental steps. Maybe it was understanding the Stokes shift to separate colors, or harnessing the incredible binding power of biotin, or precisely controlling an enzyme like alkaline phosphatase or HRP. Which of these leaps from hazardous stains to radioactive probes to enzyme tricks to the physics of fluorescence, which specific innovation do you think was the single biggest game changer for forensic science? Something to mull over.
Definitely something to think about. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us and digging into the details of DNA detection with us. We hope you feel better equipped with this knowledge.